Welcome here. Those great Welcome here. Thank you so much for everyone coming here, joining us on this special day, March 10, Uprising Day. On behalf of our Regional Tibetan Association of Massachusetts, I would like to thank especially to all the officials and special guests who are present here for your kind support by joining us here today. This is a critical movement in history of Tibet, and we really appreciate your presence here. Thank you very much again to all. I would like to begin by briefly talking about history of March 10, Uprising Day in Tibet, for those who may not know about Tibet at all. So what happened on March 10 in Tibet? On March 10, 1959, tens of thousands of Tibetan brothers and sisters took to the streets of Lhasa, Tibet's capital, rising up against China's illegal invasion and occupation of our homeland. Tibetan Uprising Day is observed every year on this day, March 10, to remember our Tibetan brothers and sisters uprising against the People's Republic of China's illegal presence in Tibet in 1959. It is also accompanied by delivery of a statement from the Central Tibetan Administrations for Tibetans in Exile and the parliamentary members in Dharamsala in India, calling for renewed efforts to restore Tibet's rightful place in the world. Today marks the 74th anniversary of the illegal invasion of Tibet by the Chinese Communist Party and 64th year since the Uprising Day. Invaded by China in 1949, the independent country of Tibet was forced to face the direct loss of life that comes from military invasion, and soon after, the loss of universal freedoms that stemmed from communist ideology and its programs such as the Cultural Revolution 1966-76. The fate of Tibet's unique national, cultural, and religious identity is seriously threatened and manipulated by the Chinese Communist Party. China's policy of occupation and oppression has resulted in no more or less than the destruction of Tibet's national independence, culture and religion, environment, and the universal human rights of people. Time and time again, the infliction of this destruction sees China break international laws within impunity. What has happened and continues to happen in Tibet 74 years ago is happening in Ukraine since last year, and the difference is obvious. Outpouring of support and global attention for Ukraine against Russia's forceful invasion of their country shows power of world leaders' choice to make decisions to help one nation over another. Without the help and the support from other powerful nations like USA, Ukraine may not be able to survive Russia's brutal torture, attacks, and forceful attempt to invade Ukraine. I wish and pray that Tibetans in Tibet and other minority groups under Chinese rule also receive similar attention and support from world leaders. Please don't get me wrong. I fully support for Ukraine and the people of Ukraine and pray that Ukraine will not lose their country to Russia. I admire people of Ukraine who has not given up and continue to fight for their country. Russia has no right at all to invade Ukraine in the first place, just as China has no right to invade Tibet in the first place. Our Tibetan brothers and sisters inside Tibet deserve the right to practice their own religion, right to have freedom of expression and speech, freedom to follow their own unique culture, and freedom to learn and speak their own language. Speaking of language, most recently, according to the Tibet Advocacy Section, highlighting human rights violations in Chinese colonial-style boarding schools in Tibet, spotlights Chinese colonial schools which deny over 1 million Tibetan children the opportunity to learn the traditional Tibetan language and education during the month of International Day of Education, where these children affected are forced into enrollment in boarding schools, separating from their own parents and families. For example, 800 to 900,000 children ages 6 to 18 years are enrolled in primary schools, and 100,000 children ages 4 to 5 years in preschools, intentionally separating them from their own families, so that these children grow up learning only Chinese language and assimilate into Chinese culture. It is therefore extremely important and urgent matter for world leaders and people with power to come together and take drastic action to bring these children back to their own parents and families and allow them the freedom to learn their own language and follow on culture. Chinese Communist Party is desperate and doing everything they can to destroy everything in Tibet, including their identities as Tibetans. Our spiritual leader, His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama of Tibet, has tirelessly and continually worked very hard for Tibetans inside and outside of Tibet. Ever since His Holiness escaped from Tibet in 1959, when Chinese invaded our country. His Holiness is one of the most respected and revered spiritual leaders of the world, and his presence gives peace, comfort, and hope for Tibetans and his followers around the world. One of his many messages is never give up. We are truly blessed to have a leader like His Holiness the Dalai Lama leading us, and we should never give up, but rise up for our country and for others in similar situation. We Tibetans in exile has not given up our hope and will continue to fight for our country Tibet and for our Tibetan brothers and sisters inside Tibet. We cannot do this alone, and therefore we urgently need your help and support. Now is the time to take action. Please spread the word about Tibet and Tibet cause far and wide. Long live His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama. Pe Gyalo. Thank you all again for your support by coming here. Pe Gyalo. Pe Gyalo. Pe Gyalo. Thank you.
Lama tu ngā kūlo. Ke che me ma utu se te ta me ki tembe ya la la ye. Ke che me ma utu se te ta me ki tembe ya la la ye. Lo so pe mi nam. Sam li mi nam tu ja do lo so tembe bang bu te ji. Sam li mi nam tu ja do lo so tembe bang bu te ji. Pen jo da ki do ken. Jam ke che bo kong sa yi she no po she she pe me zong zi. Jam ke che bo kong sa yi she no po she she pe me zong zi. Ka wo she ba la ma. Se ye ja ma pe ne ta de dong di. Mi ma lo sho, se ye ja ma pe le da de tong di, ye je mi ma lo sho.
Thank you so much. Next, we have 1 minute silence observed in remembrance of those Tibetans who lost their lives for our country. Thank you. Next, we have a speech by our special guest, Thondup Tsering. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us. Before I share my remarks, I want to acknowledge some folks who have stood for truth, stood for justice, stood for freedom in Tibet, and have consistently supported the cause of Tibet, the local Tibetan community here. And so I want to thank the Amherst Town Council members. If you could raise your hand, we want to be able to acknowledge. Thank you so much. And as members would recall, town of Amherst was one of the first town in Massachusetts, going way back to 2004, to be the first town to proclaim March 10th as a Tibet Day and to raise the Tibetan National Flag. And since then, today, this year is the 64th anniversary. The town of Amherst has consistently stood by us, stood by the right side of the history, and so I want to acknowledge and thank you all for your support. We are also joined here today by Senator Ed Markey's staff, Christian Electo. If you could raise your hand, I want folks to be able to see and recognize you. And we're also going to be joined later by Senator Markey's another staff, Innocent Usuf here. And Senator Markey has really been a champion of human rights, has met with His Holiness. And I was talking earlier to Christian, was one of the few, and I say few, U.S. senators, and perhaps the only U.S. senator who actually sent a video message in support of the 8th World Parliamentary Convention that was held recently in June last year in Washington, D.C. So, means a lot. Thank you so much. This morning, we're also joined by State Representative Minty Dome's staff, Lily Steve Ackerman, and I want to acknowledge and thank you. I know the Representative Dome and Senator Joe Comerford were the two state representatives who, again, through the state, were able to get a Tibet proclamation as well. So thank you very much for your continued support. I'm not going to go too much into history, but what I'd like us to remind is those brave men and women. On March 1st, 1959, when the word got around Lhasa city that the Chinese military brigadier was trying to invite His Holiness to an entertainment program in the military camp, which is way outside of the traditional norms, and he was supposed to come without any ceremonial group or be escorted by any police. That raised a lot of concern, and so thousands of Tibetans spontaneously surrounded the Potala Palace. And as a result of that, His Holiness, on March 17th, even though the Chinese fired 2 mortar shells, His Holiness was able to escape safely to India. Had it not been for these brave men and women, had His Holiness not be able to set foot in India, in the free world, perhaps today we will not have a Tibetan government in exile. There will not be a Tibetan freedom movement. There will not be Tibet support groups. And so I think we really need to remember the tremendous sacrifice and the significance of the folks who put their lives and saved not only His Holiness, but also the freedom and the cause of Tibet. I think in the 3 different Tibet proclamations that we have today from the town of Amherst, Northampton, and Easthampton, there are 3 key points that I want to highlight. I know the town council members will be reading in detail what is in the proclamation, but I think there are 3 important things that I want to highlight. Number 1, the Chinese government, since as early as 2013, has launched a massive DNA collection campaign in Tibet. According to Human Rights Watch, according to the Citizens Lab, which is in the University of Toronto in Canada, they estimate anywhere from 900,000 to 1.2 million Tibetans, some as young as kindergarten children, were forced to give their DNA samples. And in the midst of all this, there is a USA company, Thermo Fisher Scientific, based in Waltham, Massachusetts, in our own state, who has been accused of supplying equipment to do the DNA sequencing. Whether Thermo Fisher realizes it or not, whether they're doing it knowingly or unknowingly, they are liable for being accused of promoting human rights abuse in Tibet. And so I call upon Thermo Fisher Scientific, I call upon all the shareholders of the company, the CEO, to stop supplying these equipments to the Chinese police directly. This is wrong. This is not what the United States government stands for. Okay, so my first slogan today is going to be, I'm going to say, stop DNA collection, and I want you to repeat and say, in Tibet. Sounds good? Yes. Okay. Stop DNA collection.
In Tibet.
Stop DNA collection.
In Tibet.
Stop DNA collection. In Tibet. Okay, thank you. The second point that I want to highlight is the Chinese government over the last 6 decades has tried all kinds of policies, from brutal annexation, torture, imprisonment, to liberalization, limited freedom. And now, because all these policies over all these years has failed, they have come up with a new policy where they have launched what is called Colonial boarding schools in Tibet. And what this really involves is Tibetan kids, some as young as 4 years of age, are being forcibly removed from Tibetan homes, removed from the Tibetan family, shipped and sent to China in these so-called boarding schools, so that these young Tibetans can grow up to speak Chinese language, to practice Chinese culture, and in the process, forget their identity, their language, and their culture. Just on this month, on March 6th, the United Nations Human Rights Commission had done an investigation, grilled the Chinese delegates, and they issued a report on March 6th, which calls for China to immediately abolish these boarding schools and to allow Tibetans to start their own private schools. I think for the survival of Tibetan culture, Tibetan identity, and the Tibetan freedom movement, it is imperative that our children learn Tibetan language and grow up to be a true Tibetan. So my next slogan is going to be, I'm going to say, stop boarding schools in China, stop boarding schools, and you're going to say in Tibet, okay? Stop the boarding school.
In Tibet.
Stop the boarding school.
In Tibet.
Stop the boarding school.
In Tibet.
Thank you. And then the last piece that I want to end with on a positive note is, as you may all recall, Congressman Jim McGovern reintroduced the promotion of a resolution of Tibet-China Conflict Act, Act number HR 533. And this act calls for the United States government to recognize that historically Tibet was an independent nation, contrary to what the Chinese claim. That's number one, and I think that's really significant because this has the potential to shift the US government's policy on Tibet vis-a-vis China. The second aspect of this is, based on international law, Tibetans have the right to self-determination. And that right is not being allowed by the Chinese government for the Tibetans to exercise, which I think is a gross wrong, a mistake. And so this bill really has significant aspects that I think, and this bill is, again, I think what sometimes when we as Tibetans, we think about this, we think, oh, this is going to be almost impossible to accomplish. This bill is in fact a modification of an already legislation, the Tibet Policy Act of 2002. So it's not an impossible thing, it is a doable thing. And for that to happen, I think we all need to work. And so today I call upon Representative Richard Neal, 7 other US House of Representatives from Massachusetts. There are a total of 9 of them, but Jim McGovern is the sponsor of this bill. So I call upon the remaining 8 US representatives and Senator Markey and Senator Warren's office to really support and co-sponsor this historic bill. I think this is one of those occasions where, to me, it seems like a once in a lifetime opportunity to be able to impact the US government's policy on Tibet, I think is huge. And so we all have an opportunity to make an impact. I hope we will all work together, and the town council, as well as our state and U.S. representatives, I call them, to support us on this. And then finally, I pray that His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, live long. May all his aspirations come true, and may Tibetans, inside Tibet and outside, be united soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Thundula. Next, we have reading of Town of Amherst Proclamation of Tibet Day, Amherst Town Council President Lynn Grisima, and Town Council members.
This is a wonderful crowd today, and I know you'll have a wonderful march down Route 9. I remember seeing you there during COVID, when we weren't able to gather, as it were, but I stood by the road and applauded as you went by. So this is the 5th time that the Amherst Town Council has had the honor and privilege of passing a proclamation. And I think this year's more important than ever before because of exactly what you just heard. So with that, I'm going to start with Pam Rooney.
Thank you. Whereas on March 10, 2023, Tibetans throughout the world will gather to commemorate the 64th anniversary of the Tibetan National Uprising against the brutal annexation of their country, and pay tribute to more than 1 million Tibetans who lost their life in the struggle for the freedom of Tibet. And whereas the annexation and ongoing suppression of human rights and freedom in Tibet, egregious sinicization of Tibetan Buddhism, and the intentional marginalization of Tibetan language, culture, and identity should continue to be a concern for all freedom-loving people everywhere.
Long live! Long live! Long live! People of the world! People of the world!
Support Tibet.
People of the world! China out of Tibet now!
China out of Tibet now.
China out of Tibet now!
I would, on behalf of the Regional Tibetan Association of Massachusetts, once again, I would like to thank each individual for your time and support by joining us here today. We truly appreciate your kind support for Tibet cause, and thank you very much again, and we hope that you will continue to support us in future. We also want to individually name some of the officials here, and please come. We would like to thank every officials here. So Amherst Town Council President Lynn Grisima and Town Council members, we would like to thank you so much. Thank you so much, President Lynn Grisima and Town Council members. We have Innocent Roses here, I'm so sorry. Kristen Alago, Regional Director for the 1st Congressional District for Senator Ed Markey. Thank you so much. We have Lily Stowe. We have Lily Stowe Alekman, Legislative Aide for State Representative Mint Dome. And finally, our special guest, Thondup Tsering, we would like to thank you.
Thank you.
Lama
Thank you guys.
Stop the killing! Stop the killing! Wake up! Wake up!
Lama in Tibet. In Tibet. You have all.
Justice! We want justice.
China lies!
Tibet is done.
China lies!
Tibet is done.
Tibet was never part of China. Tibet was never
Part of China.
Chinese government. Chinese government. Stop the killing.
In Tibet.
Stop the killing.
In Tibet.
Stop the torture.
In Tibet.
Stop the torture.
In Tibet.
Stop the genocide. In Tibet. Stop the genocide. In Tibet. Long live Dalai Lama. Long live Dalai Lama. Release the political prisoners now.
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 Release the pension Lama now. Release the pension. When do we want it? Velante. Velante. Now, now, now. When. Now, now, now. Free Tibet. Free Tibet. Free Tibet. Free Tibet. Long live Dalai Lama. Long live Dalai Lama. Tibet for Tibetans. Tibet for Tibetans.
The Chinese military fired 2 mortar shells. And on March 17, 1959, His Holiness, disguised as an ordinary Tibetan, dressed in traditional Tibetan chuba, escaped Tibet, and because of the bravery, the courage of the Tibetan people was surrounded and made sure that His Holiness the Dalai Lama was not abducted or kidnapped.
Tibet.
Free Tibet!
Free Tibet.
Hereby extends its congratulations to the Regional Tibetan Association of Massachusetts in recognition of the 64th anniversary of the Tibetan National Uprising against the illegal occupation of Tibet, and be it further known that the Massachusetts Senate extends its best wishes for continued success that this citation be duly signed by the President of the Senate and attested to, and a copy thereof transmitted by the Clerk of the Senate, and it's signed by the Senate President Franz Silka, the Clerk of the Senate Michael Hurley, by our own State Senator Joanne Comerford, and it's dated March 10th, 2023. Thank you.
Tibetans living in open and democratic societies, like those gathered here, will commemorate this anniversary in public. But Tibetans living in Tibet will not, nor will Tibetans living in Nepal, where Chinese influence forces them to do so in secret. And that's why it's important that you're here today, because you remember and you commemorate and you speak out for those who cannot.
Inspiration to all of us who care about the freedom and dignity of every human being.
The nation in their minds. And today we commemorate the 64th anniversary of that momentous historic occasion. Today is also our Martyrs' Day, when we remember the patriotic valor of the men and women of our nationhood.
2023, Tibetans throughout the world will gather to commemorate the 64th anniversary of the Tibetan National Uprising against the brutal annexation of their country and pay tribute to more than 1 million Tibetans who lost their lives in the struggle for freedom of Tibet.
Representatives, to join you each year on this special day, and especially today to be joined by Mayor LaChapelle, by City Council President Omar Gomez, by Kristen Aleko from Senator Markey's office. We all come here to join with you on this solemn occasion.
Long